І ми продовжуємо.
We continue work at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. The topic is from Maidan-on-barricades to Maidan-of-reforms. Has the revolution become a driver for Ukraine's civil society? Our speakers are Iryna, Bekeshkina, director of Ilko, Kucheriv, Democratic Initiatives Foundation, Volodymyr, Viatrovych, director of the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory, Ihor, Koliushko, head of the board, Center of Policy and Legal Reform, Andriy, Kulakov, program director, Internews, Ukraine, Maksym, Latsyba, director of the program for civil society department, Ukrainian Center for Independent Political Research, and Shevchenko, director of the Center for Democracy and Rule of Law, co-chairman of the Council of the Reanimation package of reform. The floor is given to Iryna. Good afternoon. You know, this is symbolic. I remember that 5 years ago, on the 19th of February, our foundation decided to hold round table about Maidan and its development and its contribution into the development of civil society. And we also surveyed civil society activists. And then on the 18th of February, there was a battle. Ukrainian house was seized and the trade union's house was on fire. So this was a hot phase of Maidan, and we didn't know what will happen next. And we understood that our roundtable wouldn't happen. And also we gathered, except Mr. Shapoval, and then we decided to hold our roundtable once again, to repeat this roundtable, to hold it once again. So everyone was dismissed, and the underground was out of operation, and we wanted to have this round table in Krishchatik Street, and the underground was out of operation, and I went by taxi, and I saw crowds of people. They brought food, and on the internet there was information that food is needed because food was lacking, and in trade union's house there were people, and the house was on fire. So I came to the house of journalists, and there were two journalists with cameras, and I didn't know how they bring those cameras because cars were not allowed, and there were several journalists who came to the round table. I started to phone people, and Ihor Koliushko came from the closest barricade, and we started to speak about the prospects of the development of civil society, and we understood that this was symbolic. And the situation that we faced then, and still we have tense situation now, this was time to speak about what civil society should do. This was the time for this, and we discussed a lot of things, and today we should focus on what we need to do, what we achieved, and what we didn't achieve. And here we have speakers who represent civil society, and I think that we will have questions. And first, I would like to give the floor to Sergei Shapoval, and he will briefly tell you about the survey we held. Please, Sergei, good afternoon. We held the all-national survey in order to understand involvement of the citizens in civil activities, and also we surveyed activists. If we are speaking about national level, in 2013, 2018, in these 5 years, it is low. It is 8 to 10%. So these people believe that they participate in civil activity. We do not speak that whether they are the members of some organizations. This is just their opinion about whether they are involved in civic activities. If we are speaking about the differences between the regions, in the West, more people believe that they are involved. This is 12%, and on the whole, this is not a big figure. And in the South, this is 6%. And starting 2013, practically, these figures didn't change about the participation of people in civil society organizations, about 17%, and the highest participation in the West and in the East, and the lowest in the South. This is 10%. About volunteer activities in 2018. The number of people increased throughout the year, but this figure is, the share is 18%. Whether it is good or bad indicator, we are going to discuss this. And also about age groups. So both young people and older people are involved. Those who are 18 to 25, and also other groups are involved in volunteer activities. About the number of people that is involved in civil society organizations who participate in terms of financing, this share increases, and in 2012, 9% and 38% in 2018, and we see that in 2012, 1/3, 30% of population were involved in civil society organizations and contributed financially, and this was important activity for them. And also the attacks on civil society activists that happened this year, we asked people who is to blame, and they accuse mostly the leadership of the state and law enforcement officers who didn't protect these activists. And also many people blame those against whom this activity was directed against, and they blame these people. And an interesting trend that in the East and in the South, a big number of people blame the activists. They believe that they are to blame in these attacks. And also we surveyed representatives of different NGOs that are active in Ukraine, and practically those who were surveyed say that Maidan developed civil society in Ukraine, but opinions differ whether Maidan in itself is an important step ahead or it created some prospects for development, and this potential in some conditions may not be implemented. And if we are speaking about the opportunities to influence power by civil society organizations, before Revolution of Dignity, the opportunities to influence power, there were less opportunities of influence, and then in 2013, 2014, there was a peak of opportunities, the window opportunities after Revolution of Dignity, but after 2016 and until today, these opportunities are decreasing, but still they are significant. The main obstacles in cooperation with bodies of power, there are several reasons, not only connected with power. If we are speaking about the power, they do not take these organizations of civil society seriously, and they do not cooperate with them properly. And also they assume that some NGOs are not professional, and the society is not active enough in resolving these problems. And there are also big problems among NGOs. So there are some pocket organizations that are affiliated to some bodies of power, lack of financing of civil sector, and also dependence on donors, and also they speak about weak connection between NGOs and society. And these NGOs should represent society properly. And also about the attacks on activists. And half of our respondents in NGOs believe that this is non-systemic, but 1/3 says that recently we had large-scale campaign directed at civic activists who criticize power in sensitive issues. And the last question is about obstacles to join these organizations. And the majority of representatives of NGOs believe that this is indifference of the majority of people to civic activities, and also that the majority of people, they have other priorities. They need to provide for their families materially, and this decreases the time resources for the participation of civil society organizations. And also there is mistrust in opportunities to protect their rights, and this prevents people from participating in civil society organizations.
Well, you know, our foundation also did its opinion poll for the roundtable of 2014, and there was a question there: who would who of the Maidan activists you would like to see in politics? The most popular was Ihor, who is now a politician, and the second one was Viatrovych Volodymyr, who did not go into politics, but he is heading now the Institute of the Nationalist Memory of Ukraine. And what are you? I would like to ask him, what are you doing in order to continue implementing the ideals of the Maidan? Well, I would say that these Maidan events, they are were the events that distinguished Ukraine from among the other post-Soviet countries, and it's the role of civil society, that Ukrainian civil society is the one that, similar to the Baltic states, prevent Ukraine into getting back to the Soviet, Soviet past. After Maidan, or Euromaidan, as we call, some people call it, civil society in Ukraine has been strengthening, and these efforts, these pushes, if we may say so, that the civil society in Ukraine is giving to the authorities, they facilitate the transformation of some of the Maidan activists into the government officials. And it seems to me that one of the lessons of the so-called Orange Revolution of 2004-2005 was that many more people decided, who were the activists at Maidan, they decided to go into politics. And we could have a lot of complaints against the current Verkhovna Rada, the legislative body of this country. But in my view, it's the best, probably the best Verkhovna Rada that we have ever had, because of the number of the activists of Maidan that ended up being the members of the Verkhovna Rada, being the members of parliament. And for example, in my view, they were many of them were instrumental in stimulating some of the reforms, and it seems to me that that's a good example of how the opportunities created by Maidan were used successfully. And when I'm asked about the outcomes, the results of the events of Maidan in the reforms, in the reform efforts, my usual reply is that we are not yet at the end of this process of transformation. And this anniversary of Maidan events is an opportunity for us to remember the price that we have paid for the transformations, societal transformations that we have been undergoing. And in my view also, in the activization, so to say, the more active civil society in the eastern part of this former Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the fact that they have become, some sections of society have become more active there is a good result, an important result of the Maidan events. And so the events at Maidan were, so to say, a push to a big impetus for Ukrainian society. It resulted in the establishment of some volunteer paramilitary formations and volunteer movement of the Ukrainians in general, and it also even stimulated the development of the armed forces of Ukraine, although it's been traditionally quite conservative section of Ukrainian state. Let me ask now you, what are, in your view, the obstacles towards further transformations of Ukrainian society?
Конференції, точніше, зустрічі, від Майдану.
Thank you. As we have our today's topic, 5 years after Maidan, I would like to mention the fact that we are now in the so-called Ukrainian house, and as you know, there was sort of a university, open university established here, where the lectures were taking place, and there were the visiting professors, visiting experts who taught, who read some lectures there. And there have been a number of people who both went into politics and have started training, so to say, political activists. For example, Yulia Kucheriv was one of the high-ranking cabinet of ministers officials, and she, for example, successfully trained some specialists who become new governmental officials of current of today's Ukraine. So I agree with this statement of yours that after the victory of the revolution in Ukraine, we need to, to get to work and construct the new Ukraine. And as far as the civil society in Ukraine is concerned, what do we mean by civil society in Ukraine? Is it the charitable organizations or some other organizations, non-governmental organizations, like, for example, the human rights organizations? I would like to say that the so to say community of people who live according to the values that we can say are European values. There are more people who have reviewed their views and they started establishing new civil organizations, although many of them continue working in different economic organizations and enterprises and companies. But generally speaking, somewhat more people started feeling their responsibility for life around them, for the life around them. In our specific NGO, we initially didn't think that our organization would turn into a big donor, so to say, of people for politics, for political parties, and also for policy. Like, for example, Mr. Viatrovych went into the nationalist or national, so to say, memory sector, so to say, or area. I remember how he started at Autumn Maidan, as it was called. Those were the protests of the owners of imported second-hand cars. Getting back to the civil society, from my organization alone, 3 people went into Ukraine's civil service. And 3 people became deputy ministers, and 3 more became directors of department directors in different ministries. So, in my view, our organization and many other organizations of this sort, they have become, so to say, the recruiting stations for today's government of Ukraine. Every year we have the people who, having worked in our organization, go into the government or into local authorities in various regions of Ukraine. This last year has been probably less active for our organization, and we are now trying to review our activities. But we would like to continue this role of a donor of people for governmental institutions and agencies of Ukraine, and therefore my overall view of the situation today is that Maidan events stimulated transformations in Ukraine's society, and for example, the decentralization effort and for example, the association of real estate owners. This is a new movement, so to say, when condominiums and their co-owners, they create their own associations. The reform of the law enforcement system, many young people especially went into law enforcement agencies after Maidan events, and therefore they all contribute to the creation of the new country. And I think that this energy, negative energy that the citizenry of Ukraine displayed at Maidan should be transformed into constructive energy in support of the reforms. You know, I'm sometimes surprised
Yanukovych.
when I look at the sequence of events since 2014, when Maidan resembled what we know as a siege. In Ukraine's history, there was a period of time when in the south there was the stronghold of the Cossacks who were not subordinated to anybody. They wanted to go under into the register for the Polish army, but the Polish crown resisted, and so they were always negative, and it ended up with a big uprising. And so siege is considered a glorious moment in Ukraine's history. So we can make this parallel between Maidan and siege. And if we compare the attitudes of Ukraine, we can say that the attitudes of positive attitudes towards the results of the Maidan. I would like now to ask Mr. Taras Shevchenko, who is the head of the RPR. This is an association that associates around 80 NGOs. Some of them are full members, some of them are associated members. They are the organizations that try to support different areas, different reforms in different realms. We are now involved in active discussions, debating the role of RPR and how its role should be made more active. So let you tell us about your activities. In my view, in the last 5 years, this reform package that we know as Reanimation package of reforms has become this, main outcome. The first presentation of it was in September of 2014 when we presented the first plan of action for the reanimation reforms, and it had started even earlier, as Mr. Viatrovych would remember. And as Maidan was becoming less peaceful and violence started there, the revolution started there. It's no wonder that already on February the 19th of 2014, when the clashes with the police were initiated, that name already was in place. So these were the protests as we portrayed them. There were reforms, the protests against Yanukovych, against corruption, and it was then when we started speaking about this package. And in some months later, a number of reforms were presented their continuation was, presented, and a great deal of support was provided by analytical centers. For example, different institutions, different organizations, they had their own drafts and projects, reform projects, but they were not implemented. For example, we managed to start implementing the reform of broadcasting system in Ukraine, public broadcasting, for example, that had been developed for 10 years before that, but was not implemented, had not been implemented before we started using it. And I think that for our society not to become, frustrated and disappointed, they should look at these opportunities that have been initiated, the reform opportunities. Another important aspect is that in Ukraine, it's the NGOs who are doing what the government is supposed to do. We in Ukraine are doing something that in the more developed countries, governmental institutions and agencies do. So, on the other hand, we cannot say that government bodies and institutions are not developed in Ukraine. But we need to contribute more to the development of the state, so that the state is better capable of exercising its functions more efficiently, better. For example, we have our activists in the public, so to say, public councils, at the ministries and other governmental bodies, but we should remember that it is positive, it is good if the government and these same ministries do things that the country needs. And so public councils in which some activists of civil society find very good posts and occupations. Not only these public councils should be active in promoting reforms. And in my view, high-quality transformations and reforms are or have been insufficient so far, and we need to do more, specifically within the framework of this reanimation package of reforms. For me, one more or another important matter is activism and accountability. Maidan gave impetus to the emergence of the new type of activist. An activist now is a person who tries to follow, to observe corruption, corruptive actions, but regrettably, in my view, in the last couple of years, the activism has, in that sense, it has started blurring, a little bit fading away, and in my view, I think this accountability effort should be made a focus for larger numbers of our citizens, so that what our citizens do is, for example, efficient in the struggle against corruption. For example, the government states with its statistics that corruption has decreased in Ukraine, but when citizens are polled, are asked about their perceptions, they usually say that, in their view, corruption has grown after Maidan. And I think that by talking too much about corruption, we somehow replicate this negative image, this lack of satisfaction of the citizenry with the activities of the authorities and their level of corruption there. So we should be more cautious in this respect, more responsible. Speaking about the role of public opinion, about the role of media, I think we should turn the floor over to Mr. Kulakov. And, for example, when we discuss the role of media and their, communicating even the negative events, we should bear in mind the role of the media. Imagine if there is a case of the students who are beaten by the police, and it's not it is not reported by the media. I think that the very events at Maidan were initiated by similar situation, and in my view, under Mr. Yanukovych, when he was the president, even some of the oligarchs who owned some media, even they were from time to time under pressure from Mr. Yanukovych, and they were frustrated, and that's why let us be cautious when we try to review the role of the media. And if we compare the situation with freedom of speech, the media and their role in our social life, if we compare the situation of today with that of 2014, what have the changes been? What has changed? Well, I would probably start by saying someone asked, what should we do in order to continue the Maidan? I would like to disagree strongly and say that we need to do our best in order to stop Maidan, because Maidan was a lot of violence, and we should probably do our best in order to get out of this reanimation situation, and we have peaceful situation in the country, and when there is no need in some heroic deeds as what happened at Maidan was later described. So we already have the armed confrontation in the east, and I think that is enough for this country. And we need to institutionalize the energy awoken by Maidan, and channel that energy into some constructive processes. For example, the reforms like a reform of the government, where the best expertise, the fresh energy is poured, so to say, into the governmental institutions, and they are made to function according to some clear standards like policy-making standards, planning, as few emergencies as possible, and some structured efforts of reforming this country. I would not say something very new if I say that with regard to the media, We probably need diversification of the media market, de-oligarchization of the media ownership system, and we need better development of regional media, local media. So decentralization reform that has been probably one of the most successful recently in Ukraine could contribute to this, autonomous, the ability to find solutions autonomously to the media, to the problems of the mass media. And I hope that the local media, the regional media would be able to formulate somehow the agenda of the local communities, and that would improve the situation, because sometimes we have in our political agenda the issues that are of interest to the large oligarchic, economic groups, financial groups. And it is exacerbated by this armed confrontation in the east of Ukraine. And we can say that our eastern neighbors, they also try to formulate some of the issues in our political agenda. Therefore, I call on our mass media to cooperate with foreign experts, foreign media, foreign colleagues, and I see the role of the media in their ability to formulate these issues for our political agenda. And here is, I cannot but mention the important role of some sociological centers, like, for example, that one that is represented here by Ms. Bekeshkina. That center does not work to service the interests of any financial or economic, special interests and oligarchs. And these goals, these issues should be interesting to the public at large, to various sections of society, and stimulate policy-making decisions, especially the reform ones, reformist decisions. Certain things that are quite obvious to the experts, like, for example, how the local authorities and even central authorities, how they form the national or local budgets, and how their funds are expended, are spent. These things should be discussed broader, in my view. And we should not keep all our hopes tied up to, for example, to the top-level governmental institutions like the presidency. They have their own limitations according to the constitution, but the role of the local authorities should not be overlooked, because, repairing roads, do a lot of things at a local level should be the purview of local authorities, to which they should pursue. Here we have the slogan, "We are against populism." It's the time of competent people. I fully agree this slogan, and society and mass media, through their joint efforts, are only capable to achieve this, to implement this slogan. We should become less emotional and become more rational so that we can pursue our transformation efforts, the transformations of various walks of life of this country without heroic deeds and without, some crises and so on. So we have arrived practically to the issue of the upcoming elections. And what you said, I entirely agree with what you said, what you just said. And as far as I remember, someone said that the crises appear and emergencies appear wherever there is the lack of democracy. Therefore, I entirely agree with your statement that we should try to make our reforms without further Maidans. And the lack of clear prospects and predictability should be avoided. We should indeed somehow have some plans about how to continue developing this country. For example, in the opinion polls, when we started polling our citizens about the prospects of the future presidential elections, they said that the most important part of the selection process for them when they determined who would be their favorite candidate was the analysis of their electoral platforms and manifestos. So let me ask Mr. Koliushko how you see this electoral process, this electoral campaign. Well, you have somehow confused me a little bit with your introductory statement, but let me start as the previous speakers did. Let me start by addressing the Maidan. Besides different reforms, different discussions, different debates that were taking place at Maidan, I'd say that these events did not or have not yet resulted in a clear plan of reforms for the country. Although there were a lot of people who claimed to do so. There was, for example, Mr. Valery Pekar, who spoke a lot about future reforms, and there was the Maidan Council meeting at which it was decided that some strategic document was to be written describing how Ukraine should proceed after the events at Maidan. But as the events at Maidan were very fluent and there were some violent developments a few days after that meeting of the Council of Maidan, that agenda and those decisions to develop these strategies somehow were lost. And some very urgent issues emerged that needed to be addressed. And certainly the discussions were better to be held before these violent events, but not during or after the events. But what happened, happened. And what I remember best was that there was a lot of naivete in all those discussions at Maidan, and one of the most popular ideas at Maidan was, for example, the idea to, and I was asked more than once to help in drafting a bill on civic control. of the authorities. I was trying to clarify what they meant by that. And the reply usually was that we should make a law that the government should not, or the parliament should not make any laws, any decisions without our own control. And we are the civil society. And I objected by saying that what do you need the government for then? If the government is controlled, and who is going to control those who control the government? And so these discussions were quite complex. And on the other hand, there was a lot of politicians who participated in the events at Maidan, who were quite knowledgeable and had some experience, had some experience before even those events started. But they were reluctant to participate in these discussions, and so these discussions haven't ended in much in terms of some new, laws or something. And when we thought about how to fix these results of that revolution, and there were a lot of discussions. For example, we were visited there at Maidan by the representatives of the US Embassy, UK Embassy. They were asking how and why these events started and were taking place, and we were giving those explanations. We were proving our legitimacy and so on, and we were successful in doing that. And the reforms that were initiated after those events, they were, so to say, the first impulse was given by the Maidan events in many instances, like, for example, the law on one of the reforms laws that was initiated yet a few months after the events in May, I think, and it was, I think, on the reform of the government. But the law was adopted only a year later, and its implementation started 1 year later after that. So we need to bear in mind that these efforts aimed at reforming our society should be more, so to say, consequential and structured. I call on you to remember that certainly the events, the Maidan events, they stimulated political processes in the country, and a lot of activists, as was mentioned, emerged. But on the other hand, we should also understand that the NGO movement that became more active in 2015, 2014, 2015, and was discussed at length at different international conferences, domestic conferences. Yet, at that time, this civil society movement, a volunteer movement, if you like, in my view, for example, the volunteer efforts reminded of more of some, hectic processes, some illness, rather, in the body, in the human body, accompanied by high temperature, by fever. If fever continues for a long time, it poses danger to the human body, and something needs to be done in order to reduce that temperature. And at that time, it seemed to me that these volunteer movements and some other expressions of civic activities were an expression, or a consequence rather, of the confrontation in the East. And my understanding was that something should have been done in order to, to complete reforms, to improve certain dire situations. But unfortunately, these expressions of civic activities, they brought about the situations when the local authorities, for example, and even sometimes the central authorities say, why should we do something here if we have the volunteers? Let them do it. Let them take care of this or that problem. Therefore, I think that for the reform efforts stimulated by the Maidan to become more efficient, each governmental institutions should be equipped with its analytical capacities, the institutions. But again, due to different limitations, a lot of these reforms of the ministries and other governmental bodies have not been completed. Now we are in the process of presidential campaign, and a lot of people ask what's going to happen in this or the other sphere with the reform efforts that were initiated recently. To conclude, a few words about our today's agenda. The colleagues have already mentioned that one of the most dangerous trends in our social life is how to counter populism, because populism is overwhelming. And half a year ago, Valery Pekar used a very good metaphor. We have come to the situation when those who criticize the presidency, for example, and the president, they, in order to be pursued as critics, they should use some swear words. Without that, it's not critique. So, in my view, I think this is an evidence of our society's inability to evaluate positively constructive achievements, positive achievements, and it's this overwhelming populism that is probably a danger, a threat to our society, number one. Looking at the activists who were charged out by Maidan, the events at Maidan, I think that those activists, those of them who go into politics, they should somehow try to, implement those values that they felt were underachieved somehow, under-realized before the Maidan events. And not just become just another politician, each of them. And speaking about specific steps that we need, I wonder if there is a new version of the electoral law, because it's been revised, and the law on political parties was the process of its revision started recently. Let's see how it ends. Speaking about the upcoming elections, I think that before these elections we have better situation than we used to have in the past, in previous elections. And the reason is, in my view, that the larger percentage of the candidates try to somehow display their, more or less long-term view of the country's future development. It's not yet scientific in many cases, but still in many of the candidates they have in their platforms, in their manifestos, they display this attitude. But at the same time, in many of these documents, we could see, provisions that indicate clearly the lack of understanding or negligence of law. For example, they make promises of reducing the utility fees, for example, the cost of the utility services, and so on and so forth, increase incomes. But they should understand, as presidential candidates, that even if they become the president of the country, it's up to the parliament to draft a law and promulgate it. It's not the province and it's not the function of the presidency. So, as I would like to conclude by saying that we have a lot of work. A lot of work remains to be done yet.
First, you see that I'm in police uniform and with foreign name. This is 911 police. This is the police of help, not of law enforcement. So you are the press, and you make a mistake. You said half of what you've said is right, and half of what your colleague said is also right. What would you say, and who can tell me this? You call bodies of power the power, and in Ukraine, power belongs to people. All the property, all material and non-material assets belong to us. And when the press says that power belongs to power, we should say that these are just bodies of power. These are servants of people. So I would like to provide an advice. You should say that these are bodies of power, not the power itself. So this will be the right slogan. People should understand that everything in the state belongs to people, not to these fraudulent officials. I worked in the industry. I built this country, and this country is one of the best countries in the world. We have wonderful women and men who are creative. So I have a question to you. Why you say this word power, this one word, power? I thank the person from the left because he said the power, and we should say the bodies of power. So we should say servant of people. Other questions, please? I would like to add something. Thank you. So civil society, who are these people? So this is the driver of the society, more active, more responsible, not always right, but more energetic and more active. That's why if we take first Maidan Orange Revolution, second Maidan Revolution of Dignity. According to our survey, so 15% of population took part, those who attended the meetings, who brought food and did other things, and this was enough. When we say that protest sentiments are the lowest, 20%, but 20% is really a lot, and they didn't decrease, and our society is in intense state. It is passive, but it can always explode. That's why we should take it into account. We are rather emotional, and I paid attention to some differences in this survey. Some people believe that they are active in civil activities, and that the number didn't decrease, and there was monitoring starting 1992. So those who are active in civil society organizations and belong to any civil unions, including artistic unions and religious unions and trade unions and everything else included, this number is not increasing. So the number of people who participate does not increase. But what did increase and what has increased, especially this year, the participation in volunteer activities and the participation in the activities of different civil society organizations. This is an organized activity. And volunteering is when you do something important, but it is a temporary activity. There are volunteers who were working through all these years, but now they are mainly participants of some organizations. So I believe that there is the opportunity to say the opinion, to say no, and there is inability to participate in some continuous routine activities, and these activities are really very important. And also in Ukraine, in Ukrainian civil society, as they say, if you have 2 Ukrainians, there will be 3 hetmans. So people get united in the face of danger, and then there are discussions, and it is normal, but when the opponent is your enemy, this is not normal. We have common goals. Maybe we have different opinions how to reach those goals, but we should get united in our civil society. And you know that there are not only discussions, there are some perceptions that if you do not share my opinion, so then people think that you're an enemy. And the third is, it is interesting, I believe, and this is my conviction, and I had it for a long time. Power should cooperate with civil society. It provides proper experience and knowledge. You cannot get this knowledge from institutes and universities. So population believes that civil society activists, they should join the power, and also activists also believe so if you see this research. But power, it provides some negative, and it's like cucumbers. They become pickles, and they become like all other pickled vegetables. Why should we compare ourselves with these cucumbers? So I believe that the main fight will be during parliamentary elections, because activists should join power, and Of course, there may be some arguments, and many activists joined power, the Revolution of Dignity. They entered parliament, and maybe there are some problems with their activities, but if we didn't have them there in the parliament, so there would be more problems. So I believe that this is the assault troops, and the society should follow those activists, and we should work more with people, with the citizens, and absence of these connections there should be organized civil society, and the lack of it is also identified by the activists, and we should be closer to people. And we may reach the public through mass media, and the activity of mass media is also a pain, because there are many successful civil society organizations that do the right job, but no one knows about it because no one speaks about it. And I would like to provide an advertisement, maybe it is too early, but we carry out negotiations with the ICTV channel to launch the second round of the organization of the new leaders, because society needs new leaders, and if they are not provided through the media, through the television, so we know then who takes this place. Maybe there are questions or comments then. If there are no questions, we thank you and wish you a good day. Thank you all.